So, the question today is, how does the island of Santorini in the Greek Aegean Islands fit in with Israel asking for a king? And so I thought I would bring that up because I knew Eric was going to focus on something different today. So, our story in 1 Samuel 8 needs a little bit of review just to bring us up to speed because we were out for the Christmas break. And so far in this series, we've looked at Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So we looked at creation, the fall, and then Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, which are really sort of these, we could kind of call them prehistoric stories. They're these stories that date back to creation and the first people, and they have this mythical quality to them. Not saying that myth is wrong, but they've got this quality that applies to everyone, everywhere along those lines about bringing chaos out of order, God's relationship to man, man's relationship to other people, man's relationship to creation. And they really hit that side of things. Then Genesis chapter 7, we sort of get the recreation of the world with the flood and the destruction of the world, and we get Noah, our great hero, who turns out to be not such a great hero at the very end, but you get this retelling of the flood and all these types of things. Then Genesis chapter 15, we get into God's covenant with Abraham. Now, it's at this point that we kind of move from those kind of prehistorical, sort of mythical, they apply to all humanity, and now the story really focuses on Israel. We get the father of Israel, the father of the covenant, the father of circumcision. We get Abraham coming along, and it's through Abraham that all the nations of the world will be blessed. But it's through Abraham that Israel will become a nation. And as we were looking at in that story, when these promises are made to Abraham that, look to the stars, your descendants will be more numerous than the stars. Can you count the grains of the sand? This is what they're going to be like. By the time Abraham dies, he's had two sons. One by his slave and one by his wife. And so you kind of go, not a great promise keeper here, along those lines. But it's going to take over 500 years before the promises made to Abraham are going to be realized in the nation of Israel. And during that time, 400 of them are going to be spent in Egypt. And the predominant amount of that time in Egypt as slaves. And so when Israel comes out of Egypt, led by Moses, we then get the promises or the covenant of God at Mount Sinai. And we talked about how, starting with Exodus chapter 20, for the next, I think, 45 verses, 45 chapters, all of those chapters take place within 1 year's time span at Mount Sinai. And it's that density of all that proportion of Scripture poured into 1 year in Israel's history that emphasizes how important the covenant, God's relationship with Israel is from an Old Testament perspective. Moving on a little bit further, we come to Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is sort of the bookend to Exodus 20. On the other side, you get Deuteronomy, which is Deutero, the second. Nomi, law, it's the second telling of the law in Deuteronomy. And the big passage there is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. This Shema passage that reiterates and refocuses the law before the people go into the promised land. In Joshua chapter 6, we had the Battle of Jericho, and how when they cross over into the promised land, first we have a rededication of the people led by Joshua, and then you have the Battle of the city of Jericho, which we talked about. And this is the beginning of Israel's conquest of the promised land. In the book of Judges, we talked about how Judges is this up and down period of about 400 years of Israel's life, where they obey God and God blesses them. But when they sin or fall into different problems of idolatry, God brings foreign nations to oppress them. And finally, we come down to God's call of Samuel, which we looked at for our last class before we took our Christmas break, and we were so rudely interrupted. No. We come down to God's call of Samuel, and we looked at how Samuel is a transition figure from the period of judges, or this theocracy, into an actual kingdom. Today, we're going to actually look at the people's call for a king, and they're asking for a king, what's taking place. And this is one of these sections where you can read this passage a lot of different ways. In fact, biblical scholars, some of the more liberal ones, would say what you have here is a passage that was probably written 400 or 500 years later that got edited into the text of Samuel. They take these covenants between the people and the king, and they edit it into that passage. And others say, no, this is the priests, the people who are ruling in the temple, and they take that kingly covenant which Samuel gave the people, and they put a negative spin on it, because there's always this power struggle in Israel between the priests in the temple and the prophets, and what's taking place on the political side with the kings. They're supposed to work together, but if you read the Old Testament, there's always this struggle between them. This is why we end up with Chronicles and Kings. Chronicles told from the priestly point of view, Kings told from the political point of view. And you kind of go, how come they seem to get these different figures in a totally different light? Well, you get different points of view. And one of the amazing things about the Old Testament and the biblical story is how so many times they will tell you the same story from different perspectives, while you have 4 Gospels. The Muslims look at it and go, this is ridiculous. Why do you have 4 stories about the same thing? But from a biblical point of view, it's that diversity of views. It allows you to see the same thing from a number of different angles that give you different insight into it and give you a fuller picture. So, 1 Samuel chapter 8, bringing us up to speed here. When Israel has come into the Promised Land, they've occupied sort of the central hillland or mountainous territory in Israel. Along the Mediterranean, you have coastal plains. Along the Jordan River, you have a fertile, well, semi-fertile. I mean, the Jordan River is it's like calling Fountain Creek a river, you know. It's not like living in the Midwest where you have like the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, you know, which are really rivers. You know, it's kind of like I got to live in British Columbia for a while. We'd go mountain biking there, and it's like they have trees there. Okay? These things are like 20 feet across at the base. Their roots extend out like 30 feet from the tree. You got to go way. I mean, the ferns are over your head. You know, and then you come mountain biking in Colorado Springs, and you have these scrub oak tree, and they're like this high, and they've just got an attitude issue. But the key thing is that you've got these 2 fertile areas and flat areas down the Jordan River Valley and down along the Mediterranean Sea. And this is where the cultures and the societies that are able to thrive exist. Up in the Judean hill area, it's much more difficult to eke out a living. You don't have as much water, you don't have as much fertile land. And so this is the area that Israel is able to come in, conquer, and displace the weaker nations. The problem is, as you read the book of Judges, it's these nations down there around the Galilean Sea and along the Mediterranean Sea, these stronger cultures that they are constantly coming into conflict with. And as the people of Israel grow, they come into more and more conflict with those cultures. And as those cultures grow, they're going to come into more conflict with Israel as well. The second thing about here is that the period of Judges is ending. We talked about this with Samuel and his call. He is the last judge. He's going to displace Eli and the other judges that we read about and appoint the king of Israel. I already talked about the third point there. This brings us to the final point, the Philistines, which brings us to the question of why did I show you the video of Santorini, the Greek island, at the beginning here. And we shall talk about that here in a bit here. But when we look at the Mediterranean region here, one of the things that we need to realize is that Israel occupies this little strip of land going north-south right along the Mediterranean coast. And they are not an island unto themselves. You saw this with the Philistines. We saw this with Israel being captive for 400 years in Egypt. You need to understand what's taking place in all these other cultures. Now, the first thing to realize here is we have what are called the Sea Peoples. Sometimes this is how they're translated in the Old Testament if you have a Net Bible or some of the more recent ones. Other times they translate as the Philistines, depending on the passage. But when we read of these other empires, so for example up here in southern Turkey, you had the Hittite Empire, which was kind of a really, really strange empire. It was basically a warrior nation. They were up there in southern Turkey. But then you see the other arrows coming down. You've got sort of the region around Phoenicia, Tyre. Then you've got Israel, the second arrow coming down, and then finally down into Egypt. What takes place here is this question of where did these sea peoples come? Because wherever they went, there was turmoil that took place. And one of the things that happens is it looks like they begin to spread out. We know this from the Hittite documents. We know this from the Egyptian documents. They seem to spread out around 1600 BC. Well, what happens in 1600 BC? You've got this island in Greece called Thera, which is fairly large, but it's sitting on top of a magma caldera, and it blows its top. And it's a volcano that makes Krakatoa look like child's play. In fact, in some of the areas there's 70 meters of ash and debris on some of these Greek islands from when this island Thera blew. The result is that it left behind this little rim of the volcano that is now the Greek island of Santorini, where everybody goes for their vacations. But when this island blew, you had a major culture over there in that region there that was centered on these Greek islands, and it was primarily on the island of Crete. And it was the Minoan culture. Or if you study classical Greek, it would be called Linear A. But we're going to go with Minoan, which is named after the great Greek king, Minos, who had the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Remember the stories about, that? But he's over there on Crete. So when Thera blows its top and it becomes the island of Santorini, what happens is the entire region where the Minoan population lived, where their culture was, is now uninhabitable. And the people there spread out by ships. And when they do so, it's not like a few Mexicans coming across the U.S. border getting jobs and then going back. It would be like all of Mexico coming into the United States. This is a huge population shift that takes place. And even though it looks like these people intermingle and marry and adopt and kind of cross-pollinate with the cultures where they go, it creates a lot of problems. So the Hittite Empire falls at this time. In Egypt, you have the dynasties, I think it's the 20th dynasty, that then becomes the Hyksos dynasty, because all of a sudden you go from this purely Egyptian form of government to now a Greek-Egyptian form of government. And it's not until the 19th dynasty that they get rid of the Hyksos and they go back to a purely Greek form. But you see how these Philistines came into Egypt and actually were able to establish themselves into the royal line and finally get displaced. But we've got some pictures here from, this is from one of the Egyptian temples, and towards the end of this period, at one of the temples there, we have this depiction of a battle, and all these people with these kind of brass headbands and feathers on top are being led away as captives to be slaves or slaughtered. And these are Philistines. And this is exactly the same period that our chapter in the book of Samuel takes place, during 1 Samuel. Because one of the things that takes place in Israel is when they come into Israel, they settle in sort of southeast Israel, And there's 5 cities that they take over. Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Gath. And these are the stories that you're going to see with Goliath, with David's encounters, with Saul when he does battles against the Philistines. These are the cities that they're going to be doing place. So the Philistines come into the area there, and as kind of like Israel, they've immigrated there. They're looking for a promised land. They've been kicked out of their homeland. They're looking for a new place. But as they grow and begin to prosper, they move from the coastal areas and they start going upland, and they start coming into contact with the Jews who have been there about 400 years also and are in the hill lands and are beginning to expand out of them. So there's a lot of conflict taking place here. So this brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 4. And in 1 Samuel chapter 4, you have the story of the Battle of Ebenezer. And what takes place here in the Battle of Ebenezer helps set up what we're going to look at in chapter 8. In the Battle of Ebenezer, Samuel revealed the word of the Lord to all Israel. Then all the Israelites went out to fight the Philistines. And they camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines camped at Aphek. The Philistines arranged their forces to fight Israel. As the battle spread out, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of their men in the battle in the field. And then, okay, so they killed them. Okay, what I didn't include here was in between these verses, what takes place is Eli, who Samuel is being mentored by. Eli's 2 sons are out there in the field with Samuel. And when the battle takes place, what it looks like is Eli's sons displace Samuel because Samuel led them into battle and they lost. So Eli's sons go, oh, we know how to do this. And so they call the people out to battle, but before they do it, they send off to Shiloh and they have the ark brought down to Ebenezer. And they're going to get our magic talisman. You know, we're going to bring God right into the situation here. We're going to do battle. And when the Philistines hear this, they're terrified. But what's interesting is we get sort of this rallying cry from the Philistines. One of their prophets says, "Be strong and act like men, you Philistines, or else you will wind up serving the Hebrews the way they have served you. Act like men and fight." So the Philistines went out, fought Israel. Israel was defeated, and they ran home, and the slaughter was very great. The ark of God was taken, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed. And so it goes from Samuel having a horrible day to a much, much worse day. So Eli's sons are killed, the ark is captive. This kind of gives you a map to show you kind of what takes place here. The Philistines in the red come up, they camp at Aphek. Israel is gathered at Ebenezer, and then they defeat them and drive the Israelites back into their territory there. In the process of this, they captured the ark. So the first part here, the ark is going to start at Shiloh where they bring it down. But in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Samuel, what happens is the Philistines take the ark, they bring it down to Ashdod, put it in a temple there, and the idols are destroyed, and people start dying in the city. So the Philistines, being very smart about this, go, hey, Gath, it's your turn to host the ark for a while, and they send it off to them. And all sorts of calamities break out in Gath. And Gath sends it over to Ekron. And Ekron goes, I thought you guys liked us. You know, and it gets pushed off over that direction. And so in Ekron, what they do is they come up with this great idea. They say, build a cart. We're going to put the ark on this cart, and we're going to get 2 ox that aren't trained. You're going to put the ox on the front, and we're going to put all sorts of like little gold mice and offerings to kind of appease this deity. And we're going to put them on the cart as well. And what we're going to do is we're just going to stand back and see what the ox do. If the ox stay within Philistine territory, then we know something else is causing these problems. But if the ox take the ark back to Israel, in other words, they take the hard way, they go uphill instead of going down to the lowlands where you've got pasture. If they go back to Israel, then we will know that the Israelite God has brought this calamity upon us. Well, guess what? The ox in turn, they go uphill to Beth Shemesh, and they show up at the town there. But the problem is, as we'll see as we go along this story, the people of Israel, this is still during the period of Judges. The religion really isn't consolidated or well taught yet. And so what happens when the ark shows up there, the people go, oh, cool, look at this. And they look inside the ark. They open it up. And so God brings a plague out on that city. And just like the Philistines, they're like, oh my goodness, we're going to push this thing off. But luckily, over you've got another town, Kiriath-Jearim, and they come and take the ark over there and then contact Samuel to say that the ark has been delivered. While all this is going on, with the ark doing its little, tour of the Philistia, news of the battle comes back to Eli that his two sons have died in the battle. Eli falls backwards when he gets the news, breaks his neck, and dies. Phinehas' wife, who's pregnant with their son, when she hears about the slaughter, she dies in childbirth. So the household of Eli is wiped out with this battle. And so now Samuel is the priest or the judge in charge of Israel at this time. And the ark has been recalled or been brought back. Now what Samuel does when he knows that the ark has been brought back by these oxen, he calls all the people of Israel together, and he says, if you are really turning to the Lord with all your hearts after this horrible battle we just had at Ebenezer, if you're really turning to the Lord with all your hearts, remove from among you the foreign gods and images of Asherah. Now, this is interesting here. Remove the foreign gods and images of Asherah from among you. Because a lot of times archaeologists, they do archaeology in Israel, and they'll find these little images of Baal or Asherah or these different fertility deities from this period, and they go, oh, this is an example that Israel really was not fully Jewish at this time, that they came in and the Jewish religion kind of evolves over time. And it's one of these things where you go, did you read the Old Testament? Because in the Old Testament, we're constantly told that the people are constantly picking up little practices from other parts of their culture and bringing them in. It's like the United States. 500 years from now, if you did archaeology in the United States and you talked about the religious ceremonies that we did, they would say, oh, December 25th, that was commercialism day. That's where everybody went out and spent money and gave it to somebody else. Because that's where our money, time, effort, and all of our cultural markers are left from our culture. But does that mean that we're not Christian or there's Christians here celebrating? No, it means that we've got these culturally competing ideas. So anyways, you see this little marker here. Put away your foreign gods and the images of Asherah. Give your hearts to the Lord and serve him only. Then he will deliver you from the hands of the Philistines. So the Israelites removed the Baals and the images of Asherah, and they served the Lord only. And this is one of the key things in the Old Testament. It says constantly calling back by the prophets, by the kings, by the priests, to serve the Lord your God only. And that's why Deuteronomy 6, when we looked at the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall serve him only with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Why that is such an important passage? Because it's this theme that gets repeated throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now what happens when Samuel makes this call, and he calls Israel to come together and repent, he's really Samuel is creating like a religious revival in the city or in the Israelite camps. But because you've got all the people gathering together, how do the Philistines read this? They read this as gathering for battle. So the Philistines then gather their forces and they decide they're going to attack Israel at Mizpah, this place where all the people are gathered together. So when the Philistines hear that Israel had gathered, they went up against Israel. When the Israelites heard about this, they were afraid of the Philistines, and the Israelites said to Samuel, keep crying out to the Lord our God so that he may save us from the hands of the Philistines. As Samuel was offering burnt offerings, the Philistines approached to do battle with Israel. But on that day, the Lord thundered loudly against the Philistines. He caused them to panic, and they were defeated by Israel. Now, what's interesting about this story here is this phrase, he thundered. Because it's one of these that, A, goes against the Philistines and their religion. Remember I was talking about Baal? That Baal is a god of what? What? No? Thunder, storms, lightning, clouds. He is the God of all of these things. When we were talking about Gideon, remember with the dew, why he put the dew out, why the dew in the threshing floor was so important, because Baal is the God that would bring these things. But if God can control when the dew comes, when it doesn't, what it actually appears on, what it doesn't appear on, this was actually a slam against Baal. Or even the term that is given to Gideon that is called Jerub Baal, one who contends against Baal. This was his nickname given in that. So this God thundered against the Philistines could be a way of throwing in a little bit of theological jest at the Philistines. You know, you think you're the great God. You've got this God of thunder and lightning, but God, our God, thundered against you, and that's how you were defeated. In either case, in 1 Samuel chapter 7, the defeat of the Philistines goes straight to Yahweh. Now in chapter 8, after this defeat of the Philistines, now we come to chapter 8. And Israel asks for a king. Now the context of this is at the very start, as Eric was pointing out, that Samuel is now old, and he has appointed his sons to judge over Israel. Now it's kind of interesting. He appointed his sons to judge over Israel, but he put them in the town of Beersheba, which is in the very southern, remotest corner of Israel. In fact, it's just about before you get into a region called the Negev, which is a desert. So he puts them way down there. So even though he's got them judging, he knows these guys are two scoundrels, and so he moves them as far out of the way as possible. Kind of like, political assignments, or probably military also, We can't get rid of this guy, but we can, if he's in the Air Force, we can station him on Adak Island out there on the Aleutians. We'll put him out there somewhere where the Air Force officers bet each other if you lick the flagpole, if your tongue will freeze to it or not. That's kind of the high point of their day out there. So he sends them down there, but even down there, they made money dishonestly, they accepted bribes, they perverted justice. Now, what's interesting about these is these are the same problems that Eli had with his sons. And so Samuel, who's been raised under Eli, one of the things we realize about Samuel is while he's got great characteristics and traits, he's also got a problem in that he's been raised in the household of Eli. So the same problems you see in the household of Eli take place here. In fact, it's interesting as you go along through this story, when God tells them to give them a king, and he says, okay, I'm going to do this, but as you go through 1 Samuel, 3 more times, God's going to say, I want you to make this man king. Make Saul. Saul's the king. That's the one. I picked him. He's the one. 3 times, Samuel's going to come up and say, hey, you know what? I've got 2 sons, Phineas and, these 2 other sons. You should make one of them king. And God says, no, your line is done. And Samuel is constantly pointing or trying to get one of his sons appointed king. And God says no. So you kind of see Samuel, even though he's this great leader, he's also got personality quirks and traits within his life as well. So all the people, the leaders, elders gather, and they said, look, you are old and your sons don't follow your ways. Appoint a king over us to lead us, just like the other nations have. Now 2 things or actually probably 3 or 4 things are going on here. One, we've got the growth of Israel and the growth of other nations like the Philistines or the Midianites or these other groups that are around them that they're constantly coming into conflict with. And Israel realizes that we need a king that's going to solidify us as a nation, that's going to raise a standing army and that can lead us into battle. Someone who's going to be trained in warfare rather than the farmers grabbing their equipment and going, yeah, and go charging out to battle. We're actually going to have people who know what they're doing here. The second thing is they realize that after Eli and then Samuel, that you might get a good leader, but it only lasts for one generation at best. And so they realize that the old way just doesn't work. So on the one hand, these leaders are making a valid request. We need security. We need good leadership. We need to solidify this nation in some way, shape, form, or another. But the way the story is told here is this key phrase here is, appoint a king over us just like the other nations have. Because the problem is that we've seen, they've taken the gods, Asheroth and Baal, from these other nations and brought them in. And so now it looks like they want to emulate them on the political side. And so you've got, a number of factors that are taking place in this story here. This request greatly displeased Samuel, and if you read through the book of Samuel, you realize this is the thing, it's kind of like Catherine's always telling me, get over it, Dave. There's some things that just kind of stick, and I just can't get over them. They just keep going round and round in my life. And this is going to be the one for Samuel. That Israel wants a king. They won't take his son. And it really seems to be something where he perceives it as a rejection of himself. But God says, the people, wait a second, I'm going to go with the text here. This request displeased Samuel, for they said, give us a king to lead us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, do everything the people request of you, for it is not you that they have rejected, but it is me that they have rejected as their king. And this kind of brings us to kind of the theological crux of this passage here and why it takes place. No, I don't have it here. On the one hand, you have passages like Eric read, where it says that I, the Lord your God, am your king. That God is to be the king of Israel. During the period of Judges, we see how the judges deliver Israel. We see within the context of Samuel how just preceding to this in 1 Samuel chapter 7, how God thundered against the Philistines, and delivered them in there. So you've got, on the one hand, this very strong theocratic argument that God is to be the God of Israel, and they are to hold him as their king. And when we looked at Deuteronomy and we looked at Exodus, that the way the Old Testament laws and covenant with God is written, it's written like a king to his vassal state. It's this suzerainty treaty type thing. I will do this if you do this. I will bless you and cause you to prosper and do great things if you follow my commands, pay your taxes, and are loyal to me. But if you don't, I'm not going to guard you, I'm not going to protect you, and I will bring my tax collectors and various other people to make sure I get what I want. And so the Old Testament law is written very much along these lines. In other words, it adopts these sort of kingly covenants as a way to understand our relationship with God. And so you've got this really strong precedent in the Old Testament for understanding what's taking place here. I'm not going to find it here. On the other hand, in Deuteronomy, Moses also says that when you have a king in Israel, this is what the king is to do. And so in Deuteronomy, you have specific commands that are listed out. When you have a king, this is how the king is to rule, this is what he's to do, this is how he's to do. So Moses gave you conditions for what a king is to be like. On the other hand, we've got these commands that this is that God is to be the God of Israel, that you are to have him as your king only. And depending on whose perspective you're looking at it, it creates conflict as far as what's going on here. And that's why this passage is so difficult in the Old Testament for Old Testament scholars to look at. Because some look at this passage where you get these things where Samuel warns him. He says, here are the policies of the king who will rule over you. He will conscript your sons and put them in his chariot forces and his cavalry. They will run in front of his chariot. And starting with verse 11 forward, I'm going to kind of move through these quick here. What takes place here is all these things about he's going to conscript your sons. He's going to take your daughters to be ointment makers, cooks, and bakers. And probably what's left out of there euphemistically there is, concubines within the palace and the royal household also. And he's going to take the best of your vineyards and various things like this. All of these precepts that Samuel is giving them are common in Egyptian, Hittite, Ugaritic, other texts where it talks about this is what a king can do when you have a king. He can take 1/10 of your land. He can take your sons. He can take your daughters. He can take the best of your field. He can do these things because he's king and he needs to run his nation to do things. Obviously, a member of the Tea Party did not write 1 Samuel 8. But when Samuel gives them, instead of listing them as, here's a kingly covenant, he tells it like it's a warning. It's this warning. So this is what creates this big problem with interpreting it, is on the one hand, kings can be good or bad from a theological point of view up to now in the Old Testament. It looks like God's king of the Old Testament, but at the same token, Moses laid down laws for when you have a king, this is what he's to do. But in this passage, what's interesting is you get a straightforward kingly covenant. This is what a king, if you have a king, this is what he can do. He can take your sons, he can take your daughters, he can take your land, he can take 1/10 of your produce, he can do all these things. Straight out of all these other nations' kingly texts. So we want a king just like all the other nations. Guess what? Samuel's giving them a kingly covenant just like all the other nations. But from Samuel's perspective, this is horrible, this is bad. You don't want this type of thing. And so you end up in this huge conflict in 1 Samuel between, if Israel gets a king, it's going to be horrible. In fact, he goes a little bit later on, he's going to say, verse 18, he says, in that day, talking about when you have a king, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord won't answer you in that day. It's like the Democrats yelling at the Republicans and the Republicans yelling at the Democrats. If you vote for that person, you'll pray, but God's not going to answer you. You'll get your candidate, but woe to you, type thing. But you see Samuel's perspective definitely on this thing. As a judge, he does not want them to go that direction. But we also know from the Old Testament that these kings are then going to deliver Israel. And when you read the Psalms, the book of Psalms, almost 1/5 of the Psalms are what we would call enthronement or kingly type psalms. In fact, the psalm we read in the service today, 89 that we read in the service today, is a kingly psalm. It's talking about what it's like to have a king in Israel, a godly king, and his relationship with God and God's relationship with him and how he's going to lead the nation. So there's a positive one, Psalm 89, about what a king is to be like in Israel. So this is one of these passages in the Old Testament where, depending on if you take like a prophetic or a priestly view, Samuel's really giving a strong warning against the people of Israel. But if you take another perspective within the Old Testament, and from a cultural point of view, you go, they needed a king. They're growing, they're expanding, the nation's getting bigger, and it's impossible to administrate it based on a tribal system with elders and sort of like little warrior chiefs in your different villages. And so it becomes one of these really, really tough ones. But I think the key thing that goes through this whole thing is that Samuel, who's been leading and judging Israel up until this time, and it's really now come into his own. Eli's dead. Eli's 2 sons are out of the way. Now I get to shine in the spotlight. 1 chapter later, immediately God's saying, okay, Samuel, now it's your turn to step off the stage, and we're going to give in to the demands of the people, and we're going to appoint a king. And so that's what's taking place here. Let me see if I've got something else. Okay, so how do we understand this passage? The first thing is that the people have a legitimate gripe against Samuel. His 2 sons are corrupt, and if Samuel dies and his sons take over, things are going to be horrible in Israel. And they know this. They know the history from the book of Judges. They know it from Eli, the previous judge before him. They see what's going on. The second thing is that choosing a king here. On the one hand, they need a king, but when Samuel puts in the passage here that they want a king, or as the people say, we want a king like all the other nations, that seems to be the negative slant on it. That they think if we're like the Philistines or the Midianites or the Amalekites or these other nations, if we are like them, then we will be godly. And that seems to be the crux theological in the people's demand here. Finally, the end result of this is that Israel is going from a tribal economy to a monarchy. It's going to move from a period of judges to a king. And it's also going to move from a period where you've got the ark in the tabernacle out there in Shiloh, and it's going to move to Jerusalem where Solomon is going to build the temple. And in the process of doing that, the priesthood is going to move from sort of people who do it on a part-time basis to a paid clerical class within Jerusalem. And so not only does this passage have a little bit of theological issues here, but it's one of these major shifts in the Old Testament. In other words, after 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel is not going to be the same as it was before. And when you look at the Old Testament, if you're reading like David or Solomon or some of the prophets, one of the things you need to realize is that when they speak about the religious and the political life of Israel, it's completely different than previous to this. There were no kings. The priestly class was very disseminated. Israel was really led by judges or prophets that were raised up on a one-time basis, or people like Joshua or Moses. After this, you're going to have kings, priests, a priestly class. You're going to have a capital city. You're going to have an army. There's going to be major, major changes that take place within Israel. So that's about where I'm at today. Oh, and then Eric's sermon here that he took. Eric's sermon there really kind of follows the text as far as that this was a bad thing. But it also kind of takes a very, taking more of the religious or the prophetical kind of interpretation, I would say, on the passage, that God permits this, but he wasn't in favor of it type of view. Where other scholars would kind of argue for a different reading on the text. But that definitely follows, I think, what you have in the text there, the way it's laid out in the text and the way the text is preserved for us in the Bible. So I'll close there because we need to get ready. I see that Eric left the room. So